Good morning for some, good evening for others. I'm Ian Klaus, Senior Fellow on Global Cities and Foreign Policy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and the Director of Research and Policy at the Global Parliament of Mayors. This workshop, Democracy and the Life of Cities, is co-hosted by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and the German Marshall Fund in partnership with the Global Parliament of Mayors. Before we get started, and it's a full and exciting agenda, a few housekeeping reminders. The Chicago Council is an independent, nonpartisan, and nonprofit organization. The views expressed by individuals today are their own and do not represent the institutional positions or views of the hosts. We have wonderful attendance, so we actually had to close the event. The conversation, though, is on the record. It's being recorded, and it'll be made available after the event on YouTube. During the discussions, we invite you to use the chat to engage with the conversation. Please, we ask, ensure the statements and questions are considerate and courteous in tone and fact-based. Let's get started right away. It's my pleasure to introduce Brian Hansen, the Vice President of Studies at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs.
Thanks, Ian. I really appreciate that. And welcome, everyone. I really appreciate you joining for this conversation. It's an honor to host this event with our co-host, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and also in partnership with the Global Parliament of Mayors. This workshop actually builds on long-standing work of the Chicago Council's Center on Global Cities. And our work in this area focuses on understanding and elevating the increasingly important role of cities as actors confronting global challenges, which we do through research and convenings like this one. And as cities join together to address issues of global importance, we've seen them create new diplomatic structures to make their voices heard at the highest levels. And increasingly, cities are taking positions of global leadership. But, and I think this is really crucial, the power of cities on the global scale is built on a local foundation. Specifically, this power draws from a city's unique relationship to democracy at the block, neighborhood, and citywide scale. And of course, cities are crucibles of democracy. The very features that make cities engines of democratic practice, density, diversity, and proximity, can mold new models of democratic pluralism. And for cities to function, urban challenges must generate solutions, which can take the form of new policies, new political coalitions, and new forms of activism. One of the great advantages that cities have in nurturing democracy is that they nurture democracy around everyday concerns. They engage politicians not just on partisan issues of national politics, but on the pragmatic realities of transportation and trash pickup. Indeed, democratic life in cities goes far beyond voting. Participating in the life of the city can itself be a democratic act. Inhabiting its public spaces, visiting its museums, moving freely from neighborhood to neighborhood, demonstrating in the streets and on squares. In ways large and small, citizens can remake the city through the practice of everyday life. Now, we can't neglect that, of course, cities also face many problems: inequality, poverty, segregation, and many others. And some of these problems manifest more strongly, actually, in cities than anywhere else. But cities' local conditions are also capable of generating the dynamism and creativity needed to solve these problems. And this unique relationship to democracy, constructed locally, gives cities power that can transcend their borders. We've seen this in the vitality of city networks and in city-led global initiatives legitimated by local voices and local action. And today, we're seeing this in another context, a very tragic one, namely the war in Ukraine, where cities are not just serving as the sites of battles, but actually as targets in and of themselves. As many commentators have noted, this is no accident. If cities are places of tolerance, pluralism, cosmopolitanism, and above all, democracy, then they represent a symbolic threat to Russia's campaign as much as a tactical one. With democracy under threat, now is the time to embrace the democratic vitality that springs from cities And I'm really looking forward to the discussion today to explore these issues. I want to now hand the baton off to Heather Conley, the president of the German Marshall Fund. And of course, the German Marshall Fund of the United States has been a longtime leader in this work and has been driving conversation around the questions that we're going to discuss at this workshop. Heather, I turn it over to you.
Well, Brian, thank you so much. It is an absolute privilege to be in partnership with the Chicago Council and the Global Parliament of Mayors for this very important conversation. As our name suggests, the German Marshall Fund, our organization, hopefully on a daily basis, is the living, breathing spirit of the Marshall Plan, which this year it celebrates its 75th anniversary. That makes GMF's anniversary our 50th anniversary, but we're pretty young in comparison to the Chicago Council that's celebrating its 100th anniversary. So we congratulate the Chicago Council and these important anniversaries. But absolutely, as Brian said, as we watch the horrific tragedy in Ukraine, we understand that a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, rebuilding together with strong US leadership in partnership with Europe and other global actors, is going to play an important role in rebuilding Ukraine and its democracy. And we are very excited to be part of that conversation. But I want to share with you why GMF has been such a longstanding partner in our cities program, one of the most exciting programs that we have here at GMF. And it's simply because we believe that local voices propel ideas, leadership, and innovation that shape global and national policymaking. That we know that cities put the citizen's voice closest to their government, that local government is typically the most trusted form of government on both sides of the Atlantic, that cities have been innovating around transparency and accountability for decades. They use technology creatively, data, information, partnerships. They are doing innovative work on climate, on migration, on integration. This is where that great incubation happens. And we share with the Chicago Council the powerful idea that this propels new ideas and strengthens and fortifies democracy. That's why we're so excited to be at the halfway point of a project generously supported by the German government that works with 12 cities to fortify their democracy. So this is an exciting moment. It is a moment of geostrategic importance for the world. And we're so grateful that we're having this conversation today with your powerful voices. So thank you for allowing us to be a part of this. And Ian, let me turn this over to you so we can start that important conversation right now.
Thanks so much, Heather. On December 6th, in partnership with the United States, the Netherlands, and Germany, the German Marshall Fund and the Global Parliament of Mayors co-hosted a convening of city leaders in support of the Summit for Democracy. It was an important diplomatic event in some ways, an affirmation by national governments of the importance of democracy at the local level. This workshop was announced as a first step in follow-up to that event, proceeding in parallel with the development of the Global Mayors Declaration on Democracy. That declaration, building off of the important work of the Pact of Free Cities, is currently being reviewed by city officials around the world, including in Africa, Europe, and Latin America. Today's discussions will help build energy behind its launch at the World Urban Forum. Stay tuned. And build out in further detail important lines of policy research and implementation. Today's program will consist of 3 sessions focused on democratic life in cities. The first on transparency and accountability, the second on pluralistic democracy, and the third and final on public life in cities. Each session will include framing introductions from a moderator, followed by remarks by a scholarly expert and senior city officials. Questions and discussion will immediately follow each session. We're honored to have among our attendees today officials from more than 26 cities, from Istanbul to Waco to Seattle to Athens to Boston, Warsaw, Bristol, Izmir, Palermo, Budapest, Philadelphia, and Austin, among others. and at least 6 national governments, including the Dutch, German, and US co-hosts of the Summit for Democracy event. We also have representatives from a number of leading city networks whose combined memberships number in the thousands of cities and towns. The National League of Cities, a leading organization among them, has more than 2,400 member local governments in its organization. At its 2022 Congressional Cities Conference earlier this month, NLC mayors offered strong support to the cities of Ukraine while affirming their commitment to maintaining and strengthening democracy at home in the United States. Clarence Anthony has advanced just such work, both in the United States and internationally, throughout his career, and as CEO and Executive Director of the NLC. He will lead us now in our first session. Thank you, Clarence.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you all for providing this opportunity for the National League of Cities to be a part of this important conversation. We represent over 200 million people across the U.S. You know, I was listening to Brian as well as Heather's opening remarks, and it really framed this discussion and actually the whole day of panels and discussion, because this is, in essence, about democracy. It's about the way in which we lead, the transparency that we provide, and most importantly, the critical accountability of those decisions and interaction with local leaders. And we are simply the most trusted level of government. And plain and simple, if we don't work well, our local communities don't work well. I'd also add that with everything happening around the world, local partnership, local friendship is more important than ever, because the invasion of Ukraine is an important educational moment for democracy globally. But local partnership and friendship really overcomes some of the national issues that are being faced by Ukraine. And so we stand in solidarity and we stand in support. Our session discussion today will dive deeper into these important issues around accountability and transparency. Let me now introduce our democracy expert, who we at NLC has had the pleasure of working with in the past to strengthen democracy in some of our work. So Matt Leininger is the head of democracy of innovation at the National Conference on Citizenship. Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you to really help us frame our discussion today.
Thank you, Clarence, and thank you to the German Marshall Fund and Chicago Council and the other hosts. I find the Cities Fortifying Democracy project to be really exciting, and thank you also. I'm honored to be introduced by you, Clarence, because as people may know, NLC has also been a leader on this work for 20 years, going back to the beginnings of the Democratic Governance Panel. I work at the National Conference on Citizenship, which is a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization chartered by Congress in 1953 to improve democracy and civic life in America. And I want to acknowledge, first of all, the challenge that people leading cities face, this kind of institutional challenge that you know, the people who are mayors, city council members, staff, they're working with citizens who are simply different than their predecessors. People have higher levels of education. They have less deference to authority of all kinds. They have the internet. They're simply different. They have a greater capacity for governance, and they're less willing to be governed. And that is evident right now in the Ukrainian resistance and the whole unfolding of events over in Europe. Meanwhile, local governments, as far as their institutional capacity to respond to the demands and the capacity of citizens, they mainly have kind of an infrastructure that is about 100 years old. You know, that most local governments, along with many other institutions, they achieved their current form up in the early 20th century. So it's not easy for leaders inside these organizations to really adapt to what they need to do today. And that's particularly true of the infrastructure they have to work with when it comes to interacting directly with citizens, because as I'm sure all of you know, most of that infrastructure is also very old, it's very conventional. It has all kinds of public meetings, which give people a very limited opportunity to speak. These meetings, these 3 minutes on a microphone public meetings tend to be very frustrating for both the officials and the citizens. They tend to reduce people's trust in government. So in order to deal with these challenges, cities are improvising. They're innovating in all kinds of ways. And one way of kind of categorizing in a very broad brushstrokes this kind of innovation is there are thick forms of engagement and thin forms. So thick forms are all about small groups. It's engaging residents, sometimes many large numbers of residents, but in small groups where they can learn from each other, learn about an issue, learn from staff and officials, look at different options for what they want to see happen in a particular situation, a plan for action, figure out how they can do things themselves. So those are thick forms of engagement. They're about empowering small groups. And so when you see things like citizens' assemblies, participatory budgeting, there's all kinds of processes that are essentially all about that thick form of engagement. Then we've got thin forms, which are all about the individual. It's all about giving people a chance to kind of rate something or give a policy preference or show their ability to be part of a group. So in thin forms, are easy, they're fast, they're convenient, they're scalable. And of course, we have a zillion ways of doing them on the internet. So thick and thin are different. They're both good, for different reasons. And you see both of them proliferating all over the world. The limitations of them, and they're both, as I said, good to do. They're both difficult. And the most difficult thing about any form of engagement is getting the participants, doing the recruitment, and particularly reaching out to people who feel like they're not going to be heard, who have been marginalized in many ways. And so that's very difficult work. And that makes these innovative forms of engagement more difficult because that kind of upfront work is very difficult. And it's also part of what makes it harder is most of that engagement is focused on a decision or a policy question. And so it gets input and gets buy-in from people when it's done well, but it misses some of the other benefits. The other benefits of engagement are kind of more long-term ones. If you have better civic infrastructure, you have better levels of information overall, you have citizens participating in solving problems, not just recommending what the government should do. You have various avenues for people to develop as leaders. And you have a very large scale benefit of this in the sense that the more you can engage people and strengthen social networks, we have lots of research to show that strengthening social networks in a community is good for people's physical health, it's good for economic development, it's good for reducing crime. It has all these kind of impacts on social indicators that we're starting to see from research in a whole bunch of different disciplines. So you should be thinking about engagement, not just in terms of the decision that you have to make next month, but the infrastructure you have to help people get involved in decision-making and problem solving overall. And I'm just going to run through quickly a few kind of features of the most kind of exciting, I think the most exciting and innovative forms of engagement that are emerging around the world. One feature is that these things are regular. They're offering people opportunities to be involved in their neighborhood or their community every week or every month. A shining example of that for many years is the city of Cali in Colombia. They're multi-channel. In other words, they have different kinds of opportunities for people to be involved. Some of them are like the city of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Some of them are thin. Paris, France is one of the leaders in this. But they have different kind of ways, different opportunities that are kind of woven together. Another feature of the more exciting innovations is that they allow many kinds of employees to engage with the public. It's not just the electeds, it's not just the communications department inside the city hall, it's many people. The street sweeper at a town in Spain called Hoon became kind of a celebrity of his ability to interact with residents on Twitter. Another feature is that they provide kind of vehicles for leadership development. And Brazil's local infrastructure, the delegate-based systems they have for people to get involved are a good example of that. Two more. One is the best examples kind of create more collaboration between local government and other organizations in the community. And Mariupol, which of course is in the news now for terrible reasons, being under siege, Mariupol has actually won awards for different ways in which City Hall has interacted and collaborated with other organizations in the community. And then finally, the most exciting innovations are also ones where they're measuring people's attitudes toward what is happening. They're testing out different sorts of things and asking people in ongoing kind of ways, ongoing feedback loops. Did you like this? How could we improve it? Cities like Santa Monica in California, and also media organizations like Rappler in the Philippines have been really been pioneers in that sort of work. So I'll leave it off there, but I'm looking forward to hearing some of the other contributions from the other panelists and from people in the chat.
Matt, that was very helpful framing. And it's interesting, what you're really saying to me is that one size does not fit all. There's so many ways that we can facilitate and engage our residents. And I think the global pandemic really stretched our knowledge in a way of connecting. And so I'm really interested in some of the questions that you may get, but thank you so much for allowing us to hear those different examples. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Responding is Vice Mayor of Social Solidarity and Civil Society in Athens, Greece. Vice Mayor Katerina Gagaki, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Good evening. It's evening here in Greece. Good evening from Athens. I would like to thank you very, very much. To thank the German Marshall Fund, of course, and the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for the invitation and for the very, very warm welcome. We are here. You said a few things I would like to comment on, but I'm going to say what I had to say, and I think that we are going to find the connection there. We are here to discuss today something that extends far beyond the borders of a city, of course, or of a country. It is this invisible thread that connects people beyond the conventional characteristics of race, of color, of gender, of politics, political beliefs, or sexual orientation. We are here to discuss and further affirm our commitment to the ecumenical values of human rights, obviously, respect for the rule of law and justice. Our challenge will be to contemplate how these values actually take shape in an era of polarization and adversity, and how we, the local governments, being the closest to democratic institution to the citizen, can work together to promote and champion, of course, and enhance these causes. It's undoubtful that one of the fundamental pillars of democracy lies in transparency and accountability. These essential prerequisites for a well-functioning system of checks and balances are not necessarily a construct of the system, but I would say that that's rather an inherent need that stems from the launch of the society itself. And as arbitrary, and I think I've heard it just 2 minutes ago, as arbitrary as this sentence might sound, the last 2 years, I won't refer to the war, but I'm going to refer to the last 2 years, provide more than sufficient proof to reaffirm the notion that governing can be further strengthened by constantly seeking the feedback of citizens and actively adopting new policies and advocate for systemic entrepreneurship. During these last 2 years, during the 2-year COVID crisis, the need and the wish for progress manifested into a need for change and the social call, you could say, for a more inclusive, more democratic, more accountable city, highly accountable city and city government. And this became a #1 priority in a way. So what is important to take into consideration for me is that this priority, as it was heard before or mentioned before, was advocated by citizens as well. It is very fascinating to see and to observe the trends of the last decade. It's very obvious for us, at least in Greece, but I assume this is for all of the world, that trust and confidence towards the state slowly deteriorated over the past 2 years. Though in times of crisis and upheaval, we saw citizens approaching again the city, adopting a different approach. I would say that the people look to their governments and their local city governments, their councillors, their elected officials, and other employees. As you said, it's a very correctly you said, to set the standards of stability, which was lost, and leadership in these times of peril. And they placed upon the city and its services their sense of, you could say, security, their sense of affirmation, and for when there are fears and suspiciousness, reached out to one another and approached the local government once again. So as it might sound negative or arbitrary, COVID-19 gave us a chance. For us, at least we saw it very strong. It was very strong here in Greece. It's a smaller country, I think equally important. Gave us a chance to reintroduce ourselves and win back people's trust. We reaffirmed the timeless creed that we're all visible and equal in the eyes of the state, that our problems are tangible, that our problems matter, that we matter. And this is what we did. We heard many examples before. We implemented social programs that gave us a chance to assist people in every respect that we could imagine. I mean, we visited people also in their homes, offering a helping hand. And you could see that the whole idea and their whole position had changed. Their willingness to let us in, to accept our help, to discuss and help us with our next moves, brought them closer to the local government and reinstated. It was very obvious, their belief that the local government at its best, this is very important, can be more than a social net for those in need, more than a stimulus, more than stimulus checks or a place that supports the less fortunate. And it's at its best, the local government fosters a sense of community, a sense of belonging, belonging in a place that you can call your second home. And the people of Athens demanded, you could see that during the last 2 years, especially during the first year we were all a bit, everything was fuzzy, but the last year it was very clear. And we saw that people of Athens demanded this change in their home. They advocated very strongly for more accountability, for organized voluntary grassroots movements, for reinstated themselves as social stakeholders in an area where advocacy and participation were faded. So Athenians clearly positioned themselves as the strongest safeguard against populism. Their example pushed us, obviously, to build the key infrastructures that bolsters open governance. So in the wake of the pandemic, we have adopted a number of citywide apps that monitor demands and requests from citizens. As we open up never before used channels of interaction in order to further decentralize local government by administering the tools to connect with the citizens on a daily basis. So I think that and I'm finishing, you will all agree that the tools and the infrastructure for social progress hold little merit on their own. As elected officials or even as employees or people who actually work and are interested in what's going on in the city, we are called upon to offer our citizens a vision for a more inclusive, more understanding, more accessible city. And at the core of this quest, there is a need for human connection. The worst thing that we can do, and I understand very well that we all have our responsibilities and the demands of our everyday lives and works, but the worst thing that we can do is when we serve is remain behind the closed doors and in our offices. We saw that it was very clear here for us. So accountability, trust, transparency, these are bonds that can only be forged, allow me to say, in the streets. So the momentum we build today, the decisions that we take, the institutional approaches that we advocate for can be the building blocks for the World Urban Forum. Thank you so much for your attention. I remain at your disposal for any questions, and I cannot wait to hear the rest of the discussion.
No, thank you, Vice Mayor. And you're right. We were trying to create a place that people can call home, that they feel like they have a part of the governance process, if you will. And I'm going to call on Aberdeen, Maine. Amaju, to give us additional context about this subject. And I hope that your role in Chicago Torino Lab project is an exciting one as well.
Thank you so much, Clarence. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes. So my name is Abderrahman Amaju. I'm living in Bra, and I work with different organizations. One of them, of course, is the Gemma Marshall Fund. I'm a member of TLN, Transatlantic Inclusion Leader Network, and we try to find a way how also people from different minorities, they can have space in the public discussion. And on this last point, I would like to ask actually to the Vice Mayor for the speech, all the speech, they were so great. So I have been for 5 years in my town, a city council. I see currently how things change with COVID. A lot of things have changed in terms also of citizens' involvement. So their participation has changed so much. So do you think COVID has affected residents' expectation of transparency and accountability compared with the past, or is the same? This is something that I noticed in the small towns, also in Torino, big towns. I was wondering if this is happening everywhere, especially in the big cities.
Matt, do you want to start, and then Vice Mayor briefly, because we may get another question in.
Sure, I think that was mainly for Katerina, but I'll just quickly say that yes, I think COVID has increased people's expectations of transparency, and in fact, it's actually been a catalyst for democracy innovation. I'll put a report in the chat that shows this in it's surveying Latin American cities, but I think it cuts both ways.
Thank you.
If I might add, I think that when you become needed, you become visible. And when you become visible, you ought to become more transparent. This is what we saw here in Athens, that we were visible again. People turned to us, even though they always knew that the local government existed. The last 2 years, due to insecurities and all this terrible situation that we faced for the first time, made people turn to us again. So we became visible. It was very clear. We were asked for things that nobody had asked before from the local government. And as you become visible, you ought to become more accountable. You ought to become more transparent. I mean, this is, for me, in my brain, it should be automatic.
I'm going to open up for one question from the audience. Please be brief. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Dominic.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you to the panelists or the presenters. I had a question sort of related to the thick and thin, Matt, that you were talking about in terms of the different scales of engagement, and especially as we're heading into a post-COVID world eventually with different reliance on technology. I'm curious where you see the biggest opportunities for growth in terms of the thick and the thin types of engagement. Or conversely, really good examples of cities that are already beginning to utilize new platforms in that way.
Yeah, well, so certainly the two things are blending, as you might imagine, because of COVID and because of the technologies that we have now. So certainly there's lots of thick forms of engagement which are on Zoom, on video call of one kind or another. And I think those still have, it's not quite the same as the face-to-face being in the same room, but it still has some of the same kind of thick benefits, and also some of the same, thick is more difficult to do. It's more, you have to invest more staff time to do it. And of course, people have to invest more time in order to participate. So it cuts both ways. Another thing is that another way this is blending is through, tools like texting. You can blend face-to-face and online engagement. We've done some of this ourselves by giving people kind of these using texting platforms where you just tell them to get together with two friends, and they just press start to a number, and then through the phone they're getting questions, discussion questions to talk to within the small group face-to-face, and questions that they can answer on the platform. And then once they answer, then they see that the platform immediately just says, "Oh, you said option B. You're with 66% of the other people in this, who are participating around the country, and 22% pick C." So you use technology in those ways to kind of, to bring together some of the benefits of what the kind of good old-fashioned face-to-face conversation can give you, and also these amazing benefits that the technology can give you in this kind of instant, aggregatable, scalable, visible, type of engagement.
Thank you. I'm gonna brief question from Kevin and then Octavie.
Kevin O'Sullivan, the Democracy and Governance Center here at USAID. Matt, thanks for that framing of the thick and thin. Just a follow-up question about disinformation. We in the DRG Center, we have quite a bit of a focus on that. And recently, our leadership had participated on a Strong Cities event focused specifically on this issue of disinformation. So as a trained urban planner, I really like the context that you bring to this in terms of that information exchange. But thinking about the world that we're in right now, how do you address some of the issues in terms of creating these spaces for disinformation to foster? Thanks.
Yeah. Sure. No. So, and I think that one thing to keep in mind is the challenge, that the answers to this information are not just technological; they're also very human. That basically, some of the answers that people have tried are, let's change the algorithm, or let's change how the platform filters, or tags and things like that. Which, many of those are good answers, but you also need to kind of affect the way regular old humans process information with each other. And we know from all kinds of research that people process information best in small groups. So it's getting back to the thick side. Now you need to kind of be doing that at scale in order for have an impact on kind of misinformation and people's actions. So some of the kind of interesting experiments I see now are things like the Algorithmic Transparency Institute, which is a project connected to NCOC, where they have the civic listening core, which people can sign up for and be part of, and they get trained, and they use tools to tag misinformation they see, and they also talk together about like, well, what does this mean? Where is this data coming from? What do we make of it? Is this a trusted source? So you've got to be working, I think, on both of those sides. And I'll put the link in the chat, the civic listening core.
David?
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon from Barcelona. I have some thoughts and a question to address to Katerina Gagaki. I think it was very interesting what she was saying at the end of her intervention. She was talking about the visibility, that suddenly, if I properly understood, suddenly citizens realized that there was a city council, that there were local politicians, and they addressed to you. And what I have realized as well is that during the pandemic, for example, and my question is related to that, how can you handle at the local level the issues of democracy and city engagement that are related to regional and national governments? And the example is the pandemic. During the pandemic, most of the citizens, they turn around and they realize that they have a city council, and they were asking city council and mayors for solutions that sometimes they didn't have the powers. And that was because they always say that mayors are the first door for citizens to connect with public life. So how you can handle that when other layers, other tiers of governments, they are not up to what they have to do. And then the other part is as well how the lack of democracy or the back, let's say the bad quality of democracy taking place at the national level can affect the local level. And we have two clear examples, Hungary and Budapest. And we can see how the national government in Hungary is undermining the work of the Budapest City Council, or the case in Warsaw in Poland, which is the same. So that's also a reality that we need to confront as when you become visible as a local government.
To be quite honest, I don't have the same feeling that you, what you're describing. I mean, I had the feeling, and we had the last 2 years, we became visible, but at the same time, we were lucky, obviously, if I think of what you're saying, but we had the support of the government, the central government as well. I mean, what I want to say is that everything was so, everything became more flexible than in the past. I mean, we were able to build homes for the homeless in a month, which was something that needed a year and 2 years and 3 years and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We were given the opportunities, and we were given the tools under very specific new directories to actually take responsibility. It might be, though, that the central government did not know how to handle it, and gave us the what I say now opportunity, because it went well, but I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say the same thing 2 years ago. We were obviously, as you can understand, petrified. We didn't know what to do, but it went well at the end. But we were more flexible, we were more accessible, we were given the tools. Now, but of course nowadays, and especially when I see in my sector in social solidarity, where you see that there were issues that increased and problems are increased, like violence in the home, etc., etc. And now that things are being stabilized, I can see that I don't have the tools to fix them or be as to support my citizens as I used to during the pandemic. This is a difficult period, but I think it's going to be the big test. That's why I'm saying that this was an opportunity. If we lose it and we go back to how we were before, it's lost and we will never be trusted again. I totally believe that. If we continue working with the same flexibility and the same, unity, which cannot happen, of course. So you can understand after the war, people were different. It's always the same thing, that the history repeats itself. But this is an opportunity, and we were given the tools to provide solutions. Now, little by little, we're going back on the standard form of central government and limited tools for us. But I don't like to be negative. Let's see what happens in 6 months. We'll be over here.
Let me close on this final question that has been proposed by the National Civic League that kind of highlights Matt's point that our infrastructure system for engagement is outdated. And right now we tend to leave out populations, very diverse populations that really want to engage. And they're just asking, how can cities avoid this type of lack of engagement, to me, that we usually get the same people at the podium. I remember as mayor, I knew at the end of the meeting who was going to get up. So Matt, how do we deal with that engagement opportunity?
Yeah, you probably knew exactly what they were going to say too.
Yes, I did. It was always at me. So
right, exactly. So yeah, and it's true that the kind of this is what I was trying to say about the conventional forms of engagement that cities are kind of saddled with. They privilege people who have the time, the economic means to go to City Hall, to work, mainly in English, to step up to a microphone. So it's privileging certain sets of the community as at the exclusion of other people. So I think there's three things here. One is get beyond that, set a better table, provide opportunities for people to engage, like many of the ones that Katerina was talking about, that are in the streets, that are in people's neighborhoods, that involve food, that involve kids, and they're regular, they're fun, more of those kinds of things that are kind of, you're bringing the city decisions into community life, and setting a better table that way. Another piece is always an engagement, creating space for people to raise issues of race, difference, equity, other kinds of issues like that in very, matter-of-fact, productive, low-key sorts of ways that people can actually act on. So setting a better table in those two ways, and then being extremely energetic about getting people to the table, work those networks in your community, figure out who knows who, most people are connected to something. It's a faith community, it's a business, it's a set of neighbors. Find out where those networks are, and you can map them and do civic infrastructure scans and creative things to kind of identify them. But basically, map those networks and then work with people in those networks to bring a wide variety of people to the table.
Well, let's thank the panelists because they have been amazing. Matt and Vice Mayor, thank you so much for your thoughtful comments. And this was the perfect panel, the best panel of the day to tee off this discussion that we have. What I'm leaving here today with what I knew always, that local voices will make the difference. Local voices is standing up in Ukraine, and city to city relationship over the years makes the difference. So let's keep talking. Let's keep connecting as local government leaders, and we're going to make our world better. And as the Vice Mayor said, make our citizens feel like it's their home. Ian, I'm turning it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Clarence. Matt and Vice Mayor Gagaki, I think no summation needed after those closing remarks, Clarence. There was much, I actually think, around governance and social infrastructure that will resonate in our second panel that is focused on pluralistic democracy. Kobe Brand is a Deputy Secretary General of ICLEI, one of the world's leading city networks, local governments for sustainability. And she's also the Regional Director of ICLEI Africa. I would note that ICLEI, along with GPM, is leading on the development of the G7 city focus effort, the U7. So we're really lucky to have her with us here today. Kobe, please, the second panel is yours.
Thank you so much, Ian. And what a pleasure to be here today with you and to introduce this workshop session to you, which will explore the theme of pluralism in democracies. Allow me a few words to open the conversation by firstly noting that cities are interconnected and indeed are at the core for a sustainable, resilient, and equitable recovery, especially in pluralistic democracies. The importance of multi-level action and governance can therefore not be overstated. So we may ask, how are cities advancing democracy? This, of course, can be done through good governance. In my continent, good governance, anti-corruption, these things are at the heart of discussions for improving democracy, diversity, equity, and inclusion, embracing all of these and enabling all of these, but also through multi-level governance, which is at the heart of the work we do at ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability. ICLEI is in many ways also a data-driven organization. One of our core competencies is, for instance, providing our member cities with science-based evidence for decision-making. ICLEI USA, for example, developed the greenhouse gas emissions management protocols, which is most widely used by US local and regional governments to measure and report their local emissions. This process is automated through our ClearPath software application, also data-driven, science-driven, and which is used by more than 700 local governments in the US alone. That said, we also recognize the nature of a pluralistic democracy and the importance of equitable processes to support communities, meeting them where they are and at the moment in which they're in. This is especially also in the context of Ukraine today, and to specifically encourage actions that are tailor-made and context-specific. We're thinking of the recovery that is lying ahead for so many cities, so many mayors. Multi-level governance harnesses the cross-scale and cross-discipline relationships necessary for inclusive governance and decision-making. A whole-of-government approach is needed, whereby ministries, public administrators, and public agencies align their efforts in order to achieve maximum effectiveness. Collaborative governance can improve municipal planning, and in turn, pluralism can indeed then be strengthened. Multi-level governance is one of the most indispensable tools we have in fostering subnational and national resilience. Such collaboration should be the first step indeed in order to support countries in achieving international commitments and climate resilient development at the very local level. But this is not limited to climate change action. Cities and their citizens, in particular, are powerful drivers of change, indeed any type of change, because they can drive solutions to the challenges they face that are more progressive, more targeted, and faster acting than those delivered at national and, of course, at international levels. We know that through action on the ground, cities can be those very engines of change and those very beacons of hope. We do not have to wait forever to make change. We can act rapidly and act now and act together. We would therefore like to end off now, I would like to end off now by saying that the more institutions, organizations, governments, and cities work in collaboration with one another, the more we can seek support for actions, including capacity building, climate action and justice, and good governance, thereby strengthening pluralism in our societies, and also be a driver for peace and justice. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Ms. Stephanie Tawalawa, the Research Director at the Centre de Sciences Humaines in New Delhi. And after that, we are trying to get also another ICLEI leader, Mayor Manuel Daruja from Quilimane in Mozambique, to make a few remarks. He is struggling to connect with us, but we're hoping that by the time that it is his turn, Mayor Aruaju will be with us. So Stephanie, with this, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kobe. I'm very thrilled to be invited to participate in this event. So when I was invited to talk about, the question of pluralistic democracy in the context of cities, I started, wondering what does that mean really? And I started thinking about it with regard to the context of India, which is the country I work on and in which I currently live in. And so I can see at least three dimensions to the question of pluralism in cities. There is first, of course, political pluralism in its classical sense. That is the fact that several parties compete in municipal elections. But there is also the plurality of forms of participation beyond elections, and it has been evoked already in the previous panel. And finally, there is the social dimension of pluralism, that is the social diversity, which you were evoking, Kobe, social diversity in terms of class, gender, religion, and in the Indian context, of course, caste. So if I think of these three dimensions with regard to the Indian context on which I have worked, I would say that urban democracy in India is best summed up as actually a series of paradoxes. On the one hand, cities in India might actually appear as the weak spot of Indian democracy. 3 points on this. One, cities have long been overlooked in the institutional architecture of Indian democracy. Thus, in many cities, in the first 4 decades after independence, municipal elections would simply not happen, as the city would be managed by the regional government, the government at the state level. Local democracy was really institutionalized only with the decentralization policy that was adopted in 1992, and that made elections compulsory at the local level every 5 years. 2, so elections now do take place on a regular basis, but in India's large cities at least, municipal elections are consistently characterized by a low rate of participation. That is, about 40 to 50% of voters only participate in municipal elections. And that is because the middle classes, the urban middle classes, tend to abstain at that level of politics. Third point, elected municipal governments remain weak, even after the decentralization policy, because municipal governments lack in visibility, in authority, in resources. The mayor is usually not directed electly, therefore he or she remain very often a political figure who is not well known from voters. The municipal corporations are usually divided between a deliberative wing composed of elected representatives and an executive wing composed mostly of functionaries, of bureaucrats. And municipal government is there are 2 regimes actually in the Indian context, but municipal government is most often dominated by this executive wing. And finally, the financial and human resources of municipal governments are usually not adequate to take care of the many functions they have been endowed with by the decentralization policy. Yet, of course, this is India, so the situation is very complex. And on the other hand, cities have become, since the 1990s, privileged places for a series of experiments, which we can call democratic innovations, I suppose. Since the decentralization policy made it mandatory for local assemblies to include at least 33% of women, well, now at least 1/3 of elected councillors are women, and that does make a difference. You also have new forms of political participation that have emerged in Indian cities, and most notably in large Indian cities. The urban middle classes have started mobilizing around urban issues, not through the electoral process, but by forming neighborhood associations, by forming federations of such associations, and more generally by engaging with urban governance through different aspects. So you have the participatory schemes set up by some regional governments, for instance, in Delhi, in Mumbai, in Bangalore. But neighborhood associations also engage in urban governance out of these schemes through press statements, through classic forms of demonstrations, and a lot through the wide use of public interest litigations. The most striking innovation was perhaps that of neighborhood assemblies and the participatory budgeting, which was set up in Delhi, Delhi being a city-state. And that was set up in 2015 by a relatively new party on the Indian stage, the Aam Aadmi Party, which means the party of the common man. When that party was voted to power in 2015, it did set up neighborhood assemblies all over the cities, and it started a pilot project of participatory budgeting. Now, this initiative was radical in the Indian context because it tried to open up an avenue of participation that would bring together all city dwellers, not on the one hand, the poor and the marginalized, and on the other hand, the urban middle classes. So it tried to work across class barriers. However, that initiative did not survive beyond the pilot experiment, and the Delhi government refocused its ambition to develop a more participatory form of governance by empowering school assemblies. So in a way, the whole energy invested in mobilizing citizens around the budget of the city was refocused around mobilizing parents of public schools. And in the Indian context, again, this is quite significant because parents of the children who are in public schools are usually the poorer city dwellers. So the Aam Aadmi Party was again voted to power in 2020, but it now seems to have shifted its interest towards more digital forms of participation. And in this, of course, the COVID pandemic played a role. So while these new digital forms of participation seem to have the potential to get a larger number of people to engage, they are still less significant, in my opinion, in terms of political education that was presented by the short-lived neighborhood assemblies. So I had planned to stop here because I was repeatedly told that I should not speak for more than 5 minutes, but I'll be happy to elaborate on some of these points during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you for such a rich contribution in a very short space of time. I mean, I think here from an African perspective, we have a lot in common with India and of course with South Asia altogether, and we can relate to many of the remarks you made, and particularly also to the very important remarks you made about the progress made in terms of women coming into local government and coming into cities in leadership positions. Very important, and we see the difference where this is happening in Africa, India, and elsewhere indeed. We are now in a position that we can open the floor for discussion, because I believe that Mayor Daroju is having technical problems in joining us this afternoon. He may still, and if he does, we'll give him the floor. But in the meantime, Stephanie has made some very rich points. The issue of multi-level governance, of pluralism, where there are more than one centers of power, where people find ways to work together in sometimes unusual ways, sometimes breaking precedents. This is really what many say the world is calling for now in terms of rapid action and moving us into a new paradigm. If we look at the compounding crises that the world is facing, and just, watching the geopolitical situation shift as we speak almost on a daily basis, we certainly see that local governments and those leading people in local governments, the mayors, the governors, are at the forefront, whether it's a pandemic we are facing, whether it is issues around job creation, civil society engagement, or whether it's in fact military interventions and very unfortunate situations unfolding for communities, both in the countries affected directly by it, but also those mayors in cities who are receiving refugees all over the world. And let us also tell ourselves refugees are not just a current phenomenon in Europe. It is a growing phenomenon in many, many places of the world for many decades already. But it is ultimately the mayor that has to face providing of basic services, etc., when these situations happen, and they can't do it alone. Of course, there needs to be engagement, a really pluralistic approach to the entire problem. So let us open the floor now for discussion, and I believe you can raise your hand, please, if you do, and I will try and pick up on that. Here is great opportunity for us to unpack this further for a few minutes before we move to the third session. And I see Sam Kling, your hand is raised. I also just want to clarify, Anya, if you wanted to make an intervention, just please indicate to me. But in the meantime, I will give Sam the opportunity to take the floor. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, and thank you, Stephanie, for the really thought-provoking comments. I'm Sam Kling from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We emailed, of course. I'm wondering if you can go into a little more detail on the challenges of creating cross-class or cross-caste political movements in cities in India, and have you seen evidence of successes, and why not, if not?
Yes, that is indeed a major challenge in India, and that is why it's so exciting to observe democracy at the local level, because cities being a space of co-presence, this is where you actually, people are forced in their daily life, right, to actually interact in some way or another with very different people. And so you could expect that democratic forms of participation in cities would actually bring people of different background together much more easily than it might happen at the level of state or national politics. Now, as I said, it spontaneously does not happen like that. You do have a lot of participatory schemes in slums, typically in big cities, which are meant for slum dwellers, which are really, dealing with their very specific problems. And then you have schemes like the advanced locality management schemes in Mumbai, which was implicitly and yet clearly targeting the urban middle classes, as the issues at stake were their issues. So, as I said, the initiative of neighborhood assemblies was quite radical and interesting to watch, and it did produce some engagement of neighborhood associations. People would actually come to neighborhood assemblies because they were used to being the ones, who would speak to the administration at various levels, who would know about local problems, etc. And they were put in a somewhat difficult situation at first, because they were not considered as the de facto legitimate representatives of the neighborhood, and other people were invited to speak. So it was not always easy, but it did work. And apparently, neighborhood associations continued their engagement with the Delhi government even after this pilot experiment was stopped. Another thing which is worth mentioning, I think, is that participatory schemes do not always produce the intended effects. And the secondary or perverse effects can sometimes be very positive. So for instance, in Delhi, the chief minister launched in 2000 a scheme which was really meant to remobilize the urban middle classes in favor of her party, because there had been a lot of disappointment, if not hostility. So she did that, and it worked. these urban middle classes realized that they were wanted as citizen groups to participate in the management of urban affairs, and the scheme worked fine. But at some point, the scheme produced a listing of all neighborhood associations in the city. And that listing was used by a different type of activists working for the rights of the poor in the city. And that was around opposition to a project that wanted to privatize the distribution of water, of drinking water. So the very existence, the administrative existence of the scheme allowed activists, pro-poor activists, to put it very roughly, to actually connect, contact, and mobilize with them a different class of people. And this coalition did happen. These two kind of groups did their advocacy together, and they were actually very effective. They managed to stop the project. So that's why I think, that's why it's so fascinating to observe what is happening in cities. I think the very possibility of contacts can give somewhat unexpected directions to this type of initiatives.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And of course, indeed, what a very real example you're giving here. We, here in Africa, we work with cities from all over the continent, and we experience the same type of thing. Engagement with citizens is absolutely vital, and it really depends, I think, on the context and the topic on which you are engaging, because people can be extremely passionate about certain things, and they do not always see the whole picture, as a mayor would, for instance, have to balance up things, and often it comes to budget. And I think the whole issue of finance and accessing to financing is also very much linked to multi-level governance and the improvement of democracy and local action, because there are different citizen groups vouching for different things to happen, but then there's only limited budget that is made available to cities. And I think there's a long way to go in terms of democratization of budgeting processes, especially here in Africa. Citizens are not normally involved in the budgeting process or setting priorities to a very large extent. It's often still very much a national or centralist approach. And I wonder in India, in terms of budgeting processes, if you are experiencing engagement there as well, or is it, how does that process work in terms of bringing communities and other civil leaders into these processes?
Well, participatory budgeting is quite a rare occurrence in the urban context. In the rural context, the state of Kerala, which is a small state at the south of India, is known, by every specialist of political participation, because it set up a very ambitious plan of participatory planning. But that was meant, and that was happening mostly in rural areas. That was quite ambitious and successful, but that is different. In terms of cities, only a few cities in India do have participatory budgeting, and it's actually, I can think of 3 cities. So there was a Delhi experiment, which I mentioned. On the western coast, south of Mumbai, you have the city of Pune, which also has a participatory budgeting, but it's only a platform-based type of scheme. So basically, citizens are invited to log in and type a few issues which they consider as priorities for the development of their cities, and that's about it. And the city of Bhubaneswar, on the other side, south of Bengal, is apparently organizing to set up the same kind of scheme, which is why the neighborhood assemblies, the fact of bringing people together, bringing elected councillors and functionaries in front of them to actually discuss together in a very concrete way, the issues at stake, was so significant. But it did not happen, and it did not happen in part because multi-level governance is not easy in the Indian context, and there are rivalries between the 3 levels of government, and so it does remain a challenge.
Thank you, Stephanie, and that's also our experience. I'm interested to hear from the American perspective, what progress is being made in that regard. But clearly, more work needs to be done in these aspects. And I think this is where different city networks like Metropolis, Octavi, and ICLEI, and UCLG, and Global Parliament of Mayors, and so on, can play a vital role to bring these examples forward of excellent practice. Ian Klaus, I believe you want to raise an issue to Stephanie. You are welcome. Hey, you have the floor.
I do see a hand up, Kobe. I didn't realize it was mine, but I actually do have a question, and I'll confess it was for you. And I would also just like to make apologies on the council's behalf. Mayor Manuel tried multiple times to join, and I think it was a technical issue on our side. So please project all of your wishes for having seen him and not getting to see him on me, and not on him. He did his best. Actually, Kobe, I was curious to know, in the previous session, we had a conversation, the conversation focused in part on sort of social infrastructure around communication. And I think that resonates with what Stephanie has shared as well. And I know you're, in your experience in cities, in Cape Town in particular, but also working around the sciences, you sort of have been an innovator and a leader around communication around science. Particularly how science and changes in the environment affect people's lives in cities. I was wondering if you had any experiences to share with regards to how to communicate to different audiences in a way. Because of course that is part of the challenge of pluralistic democracy, is to make sure that everyone has access to information, everyone has access to knowledge, everyone sort of understands the relevance of policy to the policy decisions that are being made to their daily lives.
Ian, yes, I think, this is for me quite a passionate topic indeed. We work with a lot of science institutions here in Africa, but elsewhere as well, particularly in Cape Town. We've got a very lively and world-class a group of research and science institutions. So there's great exchange between, for instance, the ICLEI folk in our team and scientists. But I do think there's a lot we can further do still to bring our cities and their particular needs much closer to the science and research that is taking place. So that dialogue, in a way we see ourselves as a bridge builder. In a way we are doing citizen science ourselves, and we try and bring on in scientific and research elements in all our work that we do, all the projects that we deliver. But at the same time, we also try and build a bridge between the science community and mayors and their decision makers, so that the science is also driven in a way based on the realities and the needs of the cities at the time. And we know we cannot wait for all the scientific answers before cities need to act and make daily decisions in terms of land use management or urban planning and design and so forth. So we cannot wait for the science, and sometimes science happens within communities and while projects are rolling out, so I think bringing scientists closer is also important. And at the same time, there's a lot of translation that still needs to happen from big scientific outputs from the science world, making that accessible in a language that speaks to your local authorities and the person typically working in a local authority. Great work happening, but much more to be done, absolutely. I can carry on, but I want to give the floor to Esther Robinson, who's who's raised her hand. So Esther, the floor is yours, please.
Hi, thank you so much. This is a wonderful panel. My question was basically not every sort of governance experiment is going to be successful. So I was wondering if you could speak to what happens when a government experiment is sort of less successful or seems to be failing or not succeeding immediately. Like, how do you get the next effort going or regain that public confidence? Or how does ICLEI or other networks sort of share across the network that something didn't work without sort of shaming or blaming the local government actors that have tried something and expended that effort for this governance experiment to try to get people more involved?
Stephanie, please, you want to respond?
Well, it's a bit difficult to respond because I'm an observer. I'm not an actor, so I can say only what I've guessed from the strategies of the local governments I have observed. I guess what I've seen and why I love to observe democracy at the local level is that this is a place where you can actually observe things, and this is also the place where governments do try a lot of sometimes strange and radical things. And so I think the local level is a place of invention and innovation, most often democratic. So for instance, in the case of the Aam Aadmi Party, the Party of the Common Man that came to power in Delhi, they tried different things. At some point, they failed. The chief minister actually went around and apologized for failing and for having the wrong strategies and proposed a new strategy, and apparently managed to convince voters. I mean, of course, his apologies were not the main reason, but they've been really trying one form of participation after the other, bringing people together to decide whether or not they should form the government, starting online consultations around various schemes, proposing citizens to actually meet the chief minister himself in a city of about 20 million people on a regular basis. That did not last long because obviously the logistics was very, very difficult. So I don't have any generalizable answer beyond the fact that I think the local level, because it's a bit far, at least in the Indian context, it's a bit far from, for instance, those institutions which are supposed to control the working of government. Because this level is a bit far from the main government, all kinds of inventions and experiments are possible.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And with this, I want to thank you for your wonderful contributions today. And just before I hand back to Ian, just to say, Esther, from our perspective, we celebrate the possible, we celebrate the great, and there's so many fantastic examples coming out of our cities all over the world. And it's about celebrating success and making cities learn from each other and leapfrog and share. And there's such an incredible sense of community amongst cities, so many cities with a common purpose of building a better life for their citizens and building that sustainable city of tomorrow, that they are so eager to share and learn from each other. But also networks like ICLEI and so many others have the ability to have closed meetings where mayors or city managers or even thematic leaders on water and sanitation or whatever the topic is can come together in very closed groups where they can speak very frankly to each other. And here it is often where a city can come with a problem, with something that doesn't work in their city, and speak to 5 or 6 other cities where they've actually had similar problems or similar issues, and really have deep dive exchanges. And it's a privilege. It's an absolute privilege to facilitate this and to be part of that and to have that trust. In our networks, we go on journeys with cities. It's not a once-off in and out engagement with the city. It's almost like a lifelong journey, and there's a lot of trust amongst these city network communities, also amongst ourselves as city networks, and that's wonderful, and it's growing phenomenally. And for me, that's the only way. We need to take hands. We need everybody on board, and there's a space for everybody, and there is a need for every single organization, every single city to actually come forward and share and take each other's hands, especially in the times that we live in now. So it's about celebrating the success and the possible and making the impossible or seemingly impossible so possible. So with those words, Ian, back to you. And thank you so much for the honor of being with you today. It's always such a pleasure. Thank you so much. Ian, to you.
Thanks, Kobe. And of course, you're right. One of the sort of very amazing sights when you see mayors gather together is when they're grabbing coffee or food or waiting for a next session to begin, and they're having brief conversations, and then you get to overhear them and you realize they're actually exchanging lessons failures and successes from their own cities. And so we can dream of Mayor Manuel and Vice Mayor Kagaki right now sort of chatting on the side as we lead into our third and final session. And thank you in particular, Stephanie and Kobe, for that last session, the optimism, but also the expertise and knowledge. Octavio de la Verga is the Secretary General Metropolis, one of the leading global city networks, major cities and metropolitan areas. Kobe mentioned the importance of these networks. And Octavio is at the forefront of this work. The issue of civic engagement is at the heart of Metropolis discussions around metropolitan governance. And in fact, Metropolis's call to rethink our metropolitan spaces, which can be found highlighted, I think, in the chat, hopefully now, and then also on their website, to help advance the policy dialogue around the intersection of the built environment and democratic life. Octavio, thanks for being here, and please, the third session is yours to lead.
Hello, the pleasure is mine. Thank you. Good afternoon once again from Barcelona. It's really a pleasure to be with you today, and I thank the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and the German Marshall Fund and the Global Parliament of Mayors for inviting me to take part in this session. As you said, this topic, especially public life, is at the heart of our discussions. And I want to bring here one of the words that Professor Mary P. Ryan, in one of her books, which is about civic wars in the United States in the 19th century. She was reflecting about the civic life in some cities of the United States in the 19th century, as I said. And she says that they were less public, less democratic, and more visible scared by racial bigotry. And these words from the 19th century, I think they could be applied to the 21st century, what's happening all around the world in our cities. Maybe we could replace visible scared racial bigotry by visible scared by diversity. And this is something, if you look back to the last 10 years, maybe less, 5 years, look around the world, no matter where, no matter which country, no matter the cultural background, the political background, the religious background, there's a civic disengagement. Citizens show that they're angry. There's a certain rage, and this rage is focused most of the time to local governments, because they're the ones that have been from the most closer to them. And we look back, and the reasons could be completely different. I'm not going to judge which are the reasons, if they're right or not, but just to show you some examples. We can move from Hong Kong with the demonstrations around democracy, but we can go to Tehran with the demonstrations for women's rights, in Barcelona with the political rights, in Paris with the yellow vests, or maybe in Santiago de Chile because of the rise of the tickets, the first of the metro tickets, Bogota with the police action against citizens, but as well you have experience in USA cities with racism and police and the use of force on the streets, but as well in Ottawa some months ago with all these carriers and the vaccination, in Berlin as well with the vaccination, in Johannesburg against migrants. So it's in all continents, everywhere. And this happening most of the time in urban areas, in city context. So I think we need to reflect about that, why people feel so disengaged. What's happening to public life? And public life is not only about how we behave and how political leaders behave, but as well as what's happening on the streets. And especially one of the things, public space. What's going on public space? Who owns public space? Because for me, that's my personal opinion, public space, what's happening on public space is the reflection of the health of democracy, local democracy, and even national democracy. And my feeling is that the quality of local democracy all around the world, with certain exceptions, is really, really going backwards. And this is something we need to be aware. And we need leadership. And I'm not going to say the name, but the last week of February, we always have this UCLG, United Cities and Local Governments retreat, took place in Barcelona. I was talking to one mayor from Canada, and I said, I'm sorry if I'm very Eurocentric, I said, it's so sad to be European these days because we don't have leadership at a local level, a regional level, national level, but even at European level. Where are the leaders? I said, don't worry, Tavi, it's the same in Canada, it's the same everywhere. And the problem is that people, they don't want to engage on public affairs. They don't want to commit. And those who will be the ones who will really take the lead, they don't want to complicate their lives with dealing with public life. And here as well, we have an issue how we can produce leadership, not only at the city council, but as well with our neighbors, with the communities that really, really engage to transform this public life. We need to reflect about as well the uses of this public space. I mean, because that's where I think the pandemic has shown us how important is to have a public space which can be shared, which can be used by everybody. I mean, in public space where the city really takes place. And it's a public space which is useful for citizens, or it's only made of concrete and nobody can go on the public space. But as well, who can take ownership of this public space? And especially when we want to mobilize, I think we thought that because of the new technologies, all the demonstrations of the mobilization of citizens could be done, and it's done. And most of the times it starts on the digital platforms, on the social networks. But at the end of the day, it takes place on the streets. And that's what really, it's important. So today we have with us two persons that will speak about this public life and democracy in public life. We will start with Professor Robin Bucking. She is professor, the Charlton W. Thibault Associate Professor of History at the University of Miami, and then we'll be joined by the Deputy Mayor of Tirana, Ms. Anuela Ristani. But we'll start with Robin Bucking, whenever you want, please.
Thank you, Octavi. Thanks so much for having me here today. It's really just an honor and a pleasure to be part of this robust conversation. And thank you for quoting Mary Ryan, who is a mentor of mine as an urban historian. So we all know that cities are seedbeds of democracy. They stand at the crossroads of the global flow of people, ideas, art, culture, goods. They're incubators of innovation, and they've provided the foundation for deliberation, debate, and democratic engagement in all geographic regions across time. So at the turn of the 20th century, the philosopher and educational reformer John Dewey articulated his belief in the role that cities could play in shaping democracy. Dewey highlighted the intimate connections among the search for knowledge, the process of social engagement in urban communities, and deliberative democracy. He wrote, quote, "Democracy is freedom. If truth is at the bottom of things, freedom means giving truth a chance to show itself, a chance to well up from the depths." So Dewey is saying that cities would provide the opportunity for such deliberation to take place, since they fostered this clash of diverse cultures that enabled new visions of social engagement to emerge. Urban reformers like Dewey saw local activism as the basis for democracy and as a vehicle for addressing pressing social problems at every governmental level. The planning of urban space, though, has always laid bare the degree to which different groups exercise varying amounts of power over the process of city building. The ability to shape the city, including through land use and real estate development, architecture and design, and regulation and zoning, reflects the contested nature of urban space. It also highlights how different groups access and use urban space in a variety of ways, some that conform to the intended uses imagined by civic leaders, but others that challenge those prescribed models. So it's through these varied uses of urban space that some of the greatest examples of the expansion of democratic engagement and access to the rights of citizenship have emerged. The process of ethnic and racial groups appropriating public spaces in cities that had previously been off limits to them through policies of segregation and discrimination, for example, have made their cultures and traditions a visible part of urban life and helped them establish a sense of both local and national belonging. They have laid claim to their rights by physically occupying these spaces where they had previously been deemed unwelcome. So the so-called Bloody Sunday March across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, for example, showed the impact that staging a visible protest against racial discrimination could have on moving public policy and expanding basic rights like the right to vote. We saw these same kinds of examples with the Black Lives Matter movement, not only across America, but around the world in the summer of 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. Ethnic celebrations like the San Juan Festival in New York, the Cinco de Mayo celebrations in Los Angeles, and Chinese New Year festivals in San Francisco all became ubiquitous features of urban activity that asserted the rights of immigrant groups to occupy city spaces and claim rights even though they technically are non-citizens. And pride parades have enabled LGBTQ groups to celebrate their identities in public and gain ground in the fight for acceptance and protection at the legal level. These claims of the right to public access are mediated in urban landscapes and give new meaning as a result of spontaneous interactions that occur among different people in these places. Stephanie in the last session referred to this as the very possibility of contact. Yet recent decades have seen the privatization of public space and the criminalization of free assembly. As cities have sold naming rights to sports arenas, museums, and recreational facilities, many have worried that private interests would interfere with democratic access to public space. Indeed, new regulations imposed in cities to limit the size of public gatherings and prohibit the use of urban space for political rallies, for example, have signaled to many that private funding, political partisanship, and statewide preemption laws are impacting public access and circumscribing political rights. The creation of so-called bum-proof benches designed to keep the homeless from sleeping in parks, the increasing surveillance of public space through new technology, and the development of private parks in gated neighborhoods have forced local advocates to address the changing relationship between cities and democratic engagement. So in her classic 1961 study, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, urbanist Jane Jacobs argued that the meaning of city life was defined by what she called the web of casual public life. What was needed in cities, she claimed, was less planning and regulation and more spontaneity. That spontaneity allows for voices of multiple groups to be amplified, civic sensibilities to be activated, and cosmopolitanism to be nurtured. By providing the spaces for diverse groups to deliberate around the common good and engage with people from all walks of life, cities can continue to be the sites of knowledge building, community enrichment, deliberative democracy, and equity and inclusion that John Dewey imagined a century ago. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And it's true, we shouldn't forget that the origin of the word city comes from civitas in Latin, which means and civilization. So it's where civilization takes place. And that's important. I think I will highlight two things you said. One is the links between the design of the city and the democracy. And it's true, we should be aware that decisions on urban design are not, as we say in Spanish, innocent. They have a bias. They have political implications. Even when you decide where you place a bus station, that has implications for opportunities and for everybody. So that we need to keep in mind that. And as well how we can develop this public life where everybody is on board. And also it's linked as well on how we design these public spaces. I was thinking when I was thinking and listening to you, what happened here in some Spanish cities, that in public parks, they have designed benches, public benches, that are only for single use. So they can avoid homeless to sleep on the benches. And that shows about the quality and how we can help to be more inclusive. So thank you for your words. Now we're moving to the Deputy Mayor of Tirana, Ms. Anuela Ristani. She's in charge of international affairs and sustainable development. So please, Ms. Ristani, whenever you want.
Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you guys are. Thank you so much for having me here. It's really true. I mean, if there is a public display of democracy in our societies, it's cities. But because at the core of the cities, it's all about cohabitation. So it's about the living of people who come from different backgrounds, but who in the public life should be having the same rights and the same use of the city. The city being not just space, not just a physical area, but also the environment where they thrive. And the way we measure the level of democracies in our city is by how many people from different backgrounds and means and incomes do have the same quality of life in everything that is public, whether that is a park, whether that is access to schooling or other public services, whether that is access to transportation or access to services as well. And I do agree with you, nothing is coincidental, nothing is done accidentally. Obviously, you know, by the way you build a certain quality in a certain neighborhood, the quality of the school, of the building, of the physical building, does imply the quality of the education those kids get. The quality of a park or of a playground does imply the quality of life those people get. And so the job of us, of local administration, is to make sure that we are democratic about that space and about investments. But democracy in terms of investments, and you guys were talking here before about the budget, is not just about the budgeting. It's not just about allocating enough money into, you know, certain neighborhoods. Tirana is organized in 27 smaller units, and yes, we do the open consultation for the budgeting. So we do the open governance principles, where we go in these 27 neighborhoods and we tell them, you know, based on the population, this is the budget we have this year for investment, and these are the options, and together we decide on those options. But that is one of the simplest things, and that is something that if cities are not doing it, to my opinion, this is not rocket science, this is the minimum that we should be offering to our citizens. What is a little more hidden and a little bit more complicated is how we design the cities. And we haven't been democratic about it. In Tirana, only 20% of the people own a vehicle. And if you account for the investment, and I'm sure Tirana is not the only city, but if you account for the investment that we put in maintaining these roads for cars, maintaining parking spaces, making sure that there is space for cars, and so on and so forth, then we are only serving this 20% of our total population, whereas the other 80% that never even intends to have a vehicle does not get proportionally that amount of space in the city, and hence that amount of investment in the city. So what we've done and how we've tackled this issue is that in any new investment, we plan with democracy. So if we're building, we extended our new boulevard, and in the new boulevard, only 30% of the length of the width of the boulevard is dedicated to cars. 70% is dedicated to pedestrian areas, to sidewalks, to little side parks, and to little side areas where you can actually have, you know, exhibitions, displays, gaming, benches, sitting areas, so on and so forth. And that is of doing it. So it's not just an issue of initiative, it's an issue of real planning. When you have to plan in accordance to your population's needs, you have to plan in accordance to, you know, have to put the money where your mouth is. So really have to put the most of the money where people with no vehicles are. The same way, though, goes not just in terms of, and we're talking about how we want people to participate, but we are not the ones who need to push people's participation. We should be the ones to offer people the platform of participation. And creating stronger communities is not something that is done in an artificial way, it's something that you build organically. One of the most successful things that we did in the city, turns out that was one of the cheapest investments that we've done in the city, and that was creating really small neighborhood parks. And what we did was we used existing spaces where people would mostly park, again, that 20% of people who own a vehicle, and all of that space was transformed into little playgrounds or little sports fields or little green areas. And you could think of, oh, this only serves kids, and kids are not voters, and, you know, how does this help? Well, it doesn't just serve kids. It is a community building tool, because when you are able to collect everybody in the space in a very democratic way, no matter what their means of spending quality time are, because neighborhood parks cost no money. Being able to attend an entertainment event downstairs from your apartment building costs no money. So it can equally serve whoever, no matter what their income or their status in the society is. But it also builds communities that, by getting to know each other, they're better equipped at making their point for their community. So, you know, they have now their little park in their neighborhood. They get together and they say, well, we have to plant more trees in our neighborhood. That is something that they couldn't be doing before because they didn't even know each other. So this is not the city pushing people to participate. This is the city enabling people to participate and making sure that they do have the tools to do it. Otherwise, this doesn't happen by magic. We cannot, no matter how good we are, nobody is going to be able to just knock on every door and explain to everyone how it is important for them to participate in public life and how it is important for them to guide their elected officials on how they spend their money. It's never going to happen. What does happen, though, is that people are smarter than we give them credit for, and they do interact with each other when that opportunity arises. But I wanna introduce to you one of these issues that is very recent and that I hear so much when we're talking about how we make our cities more democratic, and that is access to technology. And we very rarely talk about how that distorts democracy in our cities. We talk so much about smart city, electronic services, access to the internet, and how we are making everything more accessible. But we are not accounting for people who either have no free access to technology or by choice they do not want to have it. We're assuming that everybody is literal in terms of, apps and solutions and internet, and we still don't know if that's the case in our cities. We do very little to assess on how much of a big chunk of people we're cutting out from participation, from the fact that they could give feedback in another way, in a way they were used to, or in the way they need to choose to be doing that. We need to give people this option as well. And I fear that in this race to make everything more automatic, which is great and which is efficient, but history has shown us that not every efficient solution is actually the best solution. So, we might not be able to, go in every household by talking to people directly. But if we keep that option open, then we are not in a very arbitrary way cutting off a certain amount of population that would otherwise not even participate in our modernized ways of communicating or of having people participate. The other example I wanted to talk to you guys is we talk so much about transportation and we talk about mobility overall in our cities. And mobility overall is one of the key indicators of democracy in our cities. And like you said, access to public transportation, how far away from...
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you should be wrapping, so we'll have some time for discussion.
No, this is my last point.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's my last point. Access to public transportation is one of the things that we keep talking about, and how far from the station we are and how far from public transportation we are. In Tirana, 92% of our population has access to some sort of transportation. But what we hadn't accounted for was how difficult we're making the lives of the people who choose no transportation and who choose no personal vehicles, but they walk within the city. And that's something that we oversee very frequently. And we found out that there are certain intersections in the city where people spend up to 6 minutes waiting for their turn to cross, because we've given so much priority to traffic, and we think in those terms, and traffic and circulation of vehicles, and we're not optimizing the ones who actually pollute less, who are more efficient in terms of how they move from A to B and to Z. And so it's not just design, it's not just about planning, and it's not just about investment, but it's also the little things that really do make the difference. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for taking your time. Such a pleasure.
No worries. It was so comprehensive. I think because, and I was very happy that you mentioned participation at the end, because normally local leaders, when they talk about public life and civic engagement, they only refer to participation, citizens' participation. And you mentioned quite a lot of things that complement Professor Back's intervention. You talk about quality of life, access to services, access to technology, investments, mobility, which are critical as well for public life. Last week I was, and I think that you made me think about something that has not been mentioned, is with all these technologies, are we becoming citizens instead of citizens commodities, data producers? And then what are our rights as well? So that's another question, maybe for another workshop. And I just want to end this. Last 2 weeks ago, there was the 8th Forum of Cohesion, the Cohesion Forum of the European Commission. And Joseph Stiglitz, the Prize Nobel, he really connected democracy with cohesion and inclusion. So about citizens. Without cohesion and inclusion, we don't have democracy. And that takes place at local level. And we have some minutes left for the discussion. I know already that Tony Pipa, Senior Fellow from the Brookings Institution, has already said he wanted to intervene. He will intervene only orally. So whenever you want.
Thank you, Octavi. And I just huge thanks for both this discussion, both in this panel as well as for the entire day. I think these are extremely important questions of trust and legitimacy. And Octavia, as you said, I think it's really important we ensure that local democracy does not go backwards. I thought the Deputy Mayor's comments were quite powerful in reinforcing how important equitable access and participation is, and how important it is to have a focus on ensuring that no one's left behind as cities seek to advance progress. And for me, it also, a lot of this discussion raises the question of how do we envision then the global leadership of cities in promoting democracy and the democratic agenda of their nations and even of global governance? How do we take what's happening at the local level and we use it as a lever to go forward, both with national governments and global governance? And I do that in the context of the experience we've had with how local cities and mayors are applying the Sustainable Development Goals, which really include key targets on responsive, inclusive, participatory decision-making, what we were talking about in the first panel, the rule of law, accountable and transparent institutions, and equity. And we've seen it enable a model of governance that incorporates both citizens as well as other stakeholders. You see places like Mannheim, Germany, which have used it as a way to engage citizens on decision-making and coordinated action. We've seen places like Bristol in the UK use it as a way to bring multiple stakeholders together to do decision-making. But we've also seen these kinds of global frameworks enable local governments to be transparent and accountable, both at the local level through things like the voluntary local reviews that New York City pioneered, in which more than 100 cities have done now, and hundreds more have signed up to. And even data dashboards where you're showing transparently what progress looks like, with a city like LA pioneered sort of an open source platform. But these commitments by cities at the local level, I think they provide a really important entry point to influence the national and global conversations on democracy and governance that we're discussing here today. And so the link between what we're talking about locally and that local action and linking that to global progress, and highlighting how often cities are on the front lines of addressing key issues and demonstrating the power of those approaching those solutions democratically. I think using these platforms then to influence where we're going nationally and globally is really important. And I would love just to hear some reflections on that. Octavia, I know it's part of what you're focused on through Metropolis, but I think it's really important that we hang on to that a bit in this conversation here today. But many thanks, and thanks for the chance to intervene and put that question on the table.
Thank you, Tony. I'm afraid because of the time, we can only have time for another intervention. I don't see any hands raised in the chat. Otherwise, I will hand it over to Ian for the closing remarks. No, I don't see any other one. So thank you, Professor Bakin. Thank you, Deputy Mayor Ristani. I think you have really tackled the critical issues around public life, and it's really challenging. I think that's something that, in the context that we shouldn't be forgetting that it's been 15 years of crisis, accumulated crisis. We started in 2008 with the financial and economic crisis. We moved to the health crisis with the coronavirus. Now we are with this war that has an impact, global impact, this war in Ukraine. And as well, we are with the climatic crisis. And that's really, it's a burden for citizens. And that's why as well, we need to take into account, and local leaders should take into account the impact of this crisis in this period. So thank you for your interventions. Thank you as well, Tony, for your intervention linking the local reality with the global realities. And it's over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Octavi, and thank you, Robin and Deputy Mayor Rustani. I think that along with Tony's final intervention, it was an exciting link between even the processes at the local level, but also the built environment at the local level, and global conversations and the ways in which those links can be further developed, and some of which exist sort of naturally. I think that it has been years of crisis, Octavi, and sometimes it is easy to get mired in the threats to democracy or society or our local communities. But I leave today optimistic, sort of with the dedication and the expertise and the willingness to learn. I think that was demonstrated. I would encourage all who joined us to follow a couple of next steps. First and foremost, please track the work that GMF Cities continues to do around strengthening cities and democracy. Going forward in June, the Global Parliament of Mayors will be having a summit focused, as you know, the WUF is focused, as many know, the WUF, World Urban Forum, is focused on the transformation of cities and urban spaces. I expect this GPM summit will be focused on democratic processes that can facilitate such transformations. At the World Urban Forum, there will also be the delivery, along with many partners, of the Global Declaration of Mayors for Democracy. And I would encourage all to track the work that the US government and other colleagues are doing throughout the year on the Summit for Democracy. I should take this opportunity right now to thank so many people who helped make today happen from the Chicago Council programming side: Kellen Martin, Florita Gunasakara, Vanessa Vardon, and Sam Kling, our colleagues at USAID and the US State Department, and other agencies of the US government who started a lot of this work back in early December. And perhaps, well, almost most importantly, sorry, Stephen Bosacker of the German Marshall Fund, who's been an intellectual partner. And
this is Vanessa Varden from the Chicago Council. I will just step in here at this point. I think we've unfortunately lost Ian, but I'll just step in and say thank you so much to everyone who joined today's conversation. The recording will be available on our YouTube channel, hopefully early next week. So be on the lookout for that. And thank you all again for joining and your absolutely wonderful participation today. We look forward to all of the future work that we'll be doing together on this.